So I posted on Instagram recently asking what bikes would people like to see me review next, and actually the most common response was, can you do another video about the Street Twin, specifically with regards to the fact that I've had it for like 2 years now, but in that period of time I've been lucky enough to ride loads of different bikes. So how does it stack up to those, and have any of them had me tempted to swap it in? So I'll talk about the stuff that I like about the Street Twin first, the stuff that I don't like, and then a few of the ones that have had me close to pulling the trigger. But before we get started, if you're new here and you want to see more motorcycle reviews like this, then please do remember to hit subscribe. So here's the good stuff first. I always think when I get back on the Street Twin that the dimensions of it are so good for riding around London, and I think that's one of the main factors that made me buy it in the first place. Even the XADV that I had from Honda recently as a press bike, you know, that looks like a practical commuting town sort of machine. It's a bit scootery in some respects, although it is based on a motorbike chassis, but it's actually physically pretty big. It's about the same weight as the Street Twin, but it carries it higher. There's loads of bodywork, and you can't get as close to the center of the bike because of the floorboards and stuff, so when you're pushing it around the garage it feels a bit more cumbersome. When you get back on the Street Twin it feels narrow. I mean, look at it from the front on, it is a narrow bike. It feels low, and you just can fit into little gaps when you filter in. You can park it in tight spots. I can easily get it into the garage if I've got other bikes in here and stuff. You know, it doesn't feel like a little bike to ride. It's weighty, it's 900 cc's. It's not like riding a 125, but it's just surprisingly nimble. And that to me is more important around town than having like storage under the seat or a top box or wind protection or anything like that. I just want to get places quickly. That's the whole point of using a motorcycle instead of public transport. I still think the engine is perfect as well for around town because it's the high torque variant of the Bonneville Twin. You don't need much more than the 55 horsepower that it does have for commuting in the city centre. And it's got 80 Newton meters of peak torque, but it produces it way down low in the revs, so it just feels really grunty off the line when you're pulling away from traffic lights and stuff like that. I had the CB1000R recently from Honda as well, and like that's a good example of a bike that just isn't built for London, and at 140 odd horsepower you just feel like you're riding it at 10%, 20% throttle everywhere you go. With the Street Twin you feel like you can actually use that torque. You can give it a decent amount of throttle and you're not going to be doing crazy speeds where you're putting other people at risk, yourself at risk, your license at risk. It's a nice balance of satisfying torque, a bit of fun, but not silly amounts of power for built-up areas. The engine sounds great as well. I still think it's one of the best sounding bikes that I've ever ridden. It's got that 270-degree firing interval, which you do hear on other bikes like the MT-07 or XSR 700, Tenere 700, you know, that whole line. It's not a particularly unique engine configuration, but I think Triumph have done a great job of getting the best sound possible out of it, and I think they do that across their whole range. The Street Triple RS, for example, with its stock exhaust, it just sounds so good and bassy, and it's the same for the Street Twin. The stock cans sound pretty damn good as it is. Now, I did put slash cut drag pipes on it for a bit. They're a bit too loud perhaps, even with the cat on, but also the Bonnevilles look best to me aesthetically with two exhausts that sweep out. It's like a defining signature feature of this generation of Bonnevilles. So I put the Vance & Hines back on, which I originally fitted to it, and they have a really nice bassy deep sound, a good rasp to them, a bit of a bark when you give it some throttle, but they're not obnoxiously loud and they look so much better. In fact, I still love how the whole bike looks. I've obviously done a few things to make it my own, and thanks to people like Motone for sending me parts to customize it a little bit. Obviously it makes it harder to let it go then, and especially, you know, if you're thinking of trading your bike for another and you're a bit fed up of yours, but you think that the bike you're considering is like super awesome looking, it can help to push you over the line a little bit. But I still, you know, when I come into the garage, I still think, oh yeah, that still looks pretty great. Another thing that I really like about it as well is the simplicity. A lot of the bikes that I've been riding recently, the 2020 bikes, you know, you get a TFT dash with phone integration. lots of buttons on the switchgear, lots of rider modes, lots of rider aids, that kind of thing. You just don't need any of that stuff for riding locally at low speeds. And actually it's nice to have a simple bike, no distractions, you just get on it and ride. For 2019, they did give the Street Twin and Street Scrambler road and rain riding modes that adjust the throttle response, and you can switch off ABS on the Street Scrambler, but on this first generation Street Twin you've just got switchable traction control. ABS is always on, no riding modes, a simple dash, not really a lot going on there, you just concentrate on your ride and enjoy it. You know, if I do need sat nav I can just mount my phone on the bars, but at the moment it's pretty rare that I'm going anywhere that I haven't been before. Now for a couple of negatives about this bike, and I think I knew about them when I bought it, so they're not a massive surprise. I've mentioned it in previous videos about the Street Twin. The brakes aren't particularly good on this version. I've tried upgrading the brake pads to EBC sintered pads. I've bled the brakes, I've tried all the little tricks, but really that 2-pot caliper on a single disc at the front, it just doesn't have that initial bite that would reassure you. Now they have addressed that too on the 2019 versions of the Street Twin and Street Scrambler. I tried that bike out recently at Triumph London, and the 4-pot Brembo that they've put on the front now is much crisper. Even just maneuvering it around outside before I set off, I could feel already with a little bit of pressure that they just felt much more reassuring. You know, with my bike, it's not to say there's not enough braking power if you need it. If you give it a good squeeze, it will stop. But a 230 kilogram bike, it is quite weighty. It is 900cc, so you can get a bit of speed up. I'd just like a little bit more bite and feel to it as reassurance when you do want to stop. The other area that it's not particularly great in is when you're doing motorway speeds. It's not really built for it, so you might say it's a bit of an unfair criticism. But it only has 5 gears, so it feels like it's revving slightly harder than you would like. And also it doesn't have that much top end power, so if you do want to accelerate and overtake from 65-70, it feels like it could do with just that little bit more pep. Now the 2019 models do have 65 horsepower instead of 55, but they still only have 5 gears. There's the T120 or Speed Twin. They're probably better options if you're doing a lot of that kind of riding. Speaking of the Speed Twin, you know, obviously that's a bike I considered swapping the Street Twin for when it came out. It's got more power. From that 1200cc Bonneville engine, it makes more like 90 odd horsepower versus the 55 of my bike. So that's a massive difference. And you can really feel it. It's got a lot more aggression to it. And it really doesn't feel like it's running out of steam up towards motorway speeds. It feels like it can go on. And it really has a big, butch, torquey feel to it. It's a great engine. And honestly, yeah, that was one of my favorite bikes that I've ridden, which is why it had me tempted. You know, the brakes are better as well. 2 4-pot Brembos at the front. The handling's a bit better with that 17-inch front wheel like you get on most, you know, naked bikes, rather than the 18 of the Street Twin, which is a little bit slower to turn in. The tires are wider and stickier, and the geometry's sharpened up a little bit as well. I also think it looks awesome, but when I borrowed one from Triumph for a couple of weeks, a press bike, I was riding it around London a lot. You know, 95% of my riding at the moment is in town. And it's so much more aggressive than the Street Twin that I actually found it easier to get along with in rain mode. You know, it needs a bit more travel in the throttle then to get that pure torquey acceleration. But then after a while I was like, oh, you know what's like a Speed Twin in rain mode? A Street Twin. And so I kind of decided to stick with the Street Twin. I loved the 1200 Scrambler XE as well. It just feels like a big monster truck of a bike. It's much better on the motorway than the Street Twin. It's got cruise control, more power, a big commanding riding position, but it's not as nimble in traffic. It's bigger, it's harder to get your feet down, it's wider in the bars, and it just didn't make sense to me to drop a bunch of money on something that essentially would get me to work a bit slower, I think. I really liked the CB650R. I think, you know, it's got the power of the Speed Twin, similar sort of 90 odd horsepower, but it comes in at the cost of the Street Twin, so just over 8 grand. I think it's a good looking bike. It's pretty compact as well for getting around town, but that inline 4 really needs revving to get the most out of it. I think peak power's at 12,000 RPM. If you're doing 12,000 revs in first or second gear, you're doing like 40 or 50 miles an hour. So again, for like 90% of the riding that I'd be doing, I would never be getting the most out of it. And I'd rather have that low down torquey feel of the Street Twin than just getting like a third or a half of the fun of an inline 4. Another couple of bikes that spring to mind were the Horwin CR6 and the new NGT. Both of these were relatively low-cost electrics, one a motorcycle, one a scooter, but they really sold me on like the practicality and cheapness of owning an electric. I loved having the ability to just roll them into the garage every night and charge them, and obviously a full charge is cheaper than a tank of petrol. But they were both a little on the slow side, and that got me thinking about the Zero SRF. I rode that at English Electric Motor Co in Suffolk and I absolutely loved it. It's got all of the thrills of a petrol bike and then all of the practicality of an electric motorcycle. I also think it's the first bike that Zero have made that I actually think is pretty good looking too, but the price was just the killer factor there. They're still up near 20 grand, and despite the savings on fuel and road tax and whatever, I still just couldn't stomach that upfront cost. But when the price does come down of electrics, I think I'll be seriously thinking about getting one. Maybe not to replace a petrol bike, but I'd maybe like to have one alongside it. So to summarize, despite having ridden all those bikes and many others that I haven't mentioned, I've stuck with the Street Twin because it suits the type of riding that I do most of the time. The only thing that's had me really reconsidering it lately is the fact that since the lockdown started, I've been working from home and it doesn't look like I'll be back in the office like anytime soon. So I'm not really doing those daily rides across London where you're cutting through a lot of traffic. Now, if I want to get out on a press bike or get out for a ride, it'll either be really, really local for an errand, or I'll be going out into Kent usually to find some twistier roads, something a bit more fun, or maybe some gravel roads if I've got an adventure bike, that kind of thing. Also, I do work with dealers to ride their demo bikes and you know, showcase those bikes as well, and quite often that does include traveling a bit further afield and doing some motorway riding, and I've already said the Street Twin isn't great at that. And it's not ideal to have loads of camera gear in a backpack on your back. So yeah, I've been thinking it would be nice to have something that has a bit of wind protection, feels a bit more comfortable at speed, can carry a bit more stuff, maybe some luggage or just a rack for strapping tripods across or something like that. And obviously when you think of all of those things, adventure bikes start to look pretty good. The Tiger 900, I went on the launch, I've ridden it a bit lately as well, and absolutely love that bike. That's one of my favorites, that's really up there. That'd really fit the bill. It's good on the motorway, good wind protection, good power. There are luggage options, and you can do a bit of off-roading as well if you'd like. The Africa Twin was also great, although a bit more expensive than the Tiger. I've got the Adventure Sport version with the DCT gearbox coming this week, so I'm looking forward to trying that one out. And you know, there are other bikes in that category like the Tenere 700. I haven't ridden that yet, so I really want to get out on that and see what that's like. It's all going to depend really on how the next few months play out. If I do end up back in the office on a regular basis, which seems like a long shot, but if that is the case, then I think the Street Twin will remain, for me anyway, the best bike for getting around London. But yeah, if I'm limited to weekend riding and just the days where I'm out filming and lugging loads of gear around with me, then I might reconsider. I'd love to hear from you guys though. I know there are loads of Street Twin and Street Scrambler owners that are subscribed to the channel, so if you've had your bike for a year or two, how are you getting on with it? What do you like? What don't you like? And does it kind of match what I've been saying, or am I talking absolute rubbish? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.